Welcome to the 7 Tulane School of Architecture Spring Lecture for our 2020-2021 series, Inhabiting the Planet. In this lecture series, we analyze and discuss the way humans are and could be inhabiting the planet from different perspectives and how architecture intersects with social, racial, environmental, economic, and health issues. Tonight, we are joined by Professor Albert Pope for a discussion about a Promethean increment. Tonight's lecture is the annual Davis-Washington Mitchell Lecture, and we thank the honors for this continued support of this lecture series. Since these events are virtual, we want to make them as dynamic as possible. Therefore, after his presentation, Professor Pope will be joined by two respondents for a conversation. The two respondents are as follows: Irene Kale, Senior Professor of Practice from Tulane University, and Margarita Jobert, Associate Professor in Architecture, also from the Tulane University. After a discussion among these three presenters, they will take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please type them on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. On either the speakers or staff will read them aloud. Now, please let me introduce our main lecturer. Professor Albert Pope is an educator, researcher, and architect based in Houston, Texas. He holds a Bachelor in Architecture from the CARC and a Master in Architecture from Princeton University. Currently, Professor Pope is the Gus Session Wortham Professor of Architecture at Rice University. But before that, he also taught at Yale University and also at the CIARC. Professor Pope has also lectured, exhibited, and written extensively in the most influential places of the contemporary architectural scene, and mainly about the design logic of contemporary cities. In fact, Professor Pope is the author of the seminal book Ladders, a book that is considered a classic in the field of urbanism, and a book that I would like just to recommend to the audience, especially now that it has been recently reissued a second edition and is almost sold out again. This book examines the urban development that occurred after World War II by analyzing 5 American cities and explaining the transformation of the urban form from a centrifugal, expansive, open city of the pre-war to a centripetal, autocentric, and suburban city in the post-war. Consequently, the character of many current cities has been shaped mainly by the infrastructure and immense urban spaces rather than built elements like the pre-war city. At Rice University, Professor Pope is also the founding director of the design program Present Future, a think tank not only to research, but also to speculate on alternative urban models for our cities. Examples of this research are the large-scale project for Houston and Detroit, proposal that he will explain during this lecture, and proposal that will allow him to demonstrate a design methodology that connects both the small scale of the architecture and the larger scale one of the city, so the design can address the different demands of a contemporary urban environment. As I mentioned, Professors Irene Kale and Margarita Jobert will respond to Professor Pope after his lecture. Irene Kale is a senior professor of practice here at Tulane University. She has an architectural degrees from Germany and the United States, and initially worked in both countries with firms like OM Ungers in Cologne, Jürgen Sawat in Berlin, and Studio Works in Los Angeles. Professor Kale leads her own firm based in both Berlin and New Orleans, where she has worked on projects ranging from urban design proposals and competition to large-scale building projects and small-scale interiors. And Margarita Jobert, our second respondent, is an associate professor here at Tulane University. She received her architectural degrees from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia in Spain, and she is the founder and partner of the internationally awarded firm Aldair Jobert Architecture and Landscape, a multidisciplinary research-based practice that focuses on innovation and is particularly renowned for its leadership in a new approach to the relation between cities and rivers. Please join me to welcome Professor Pope and Professor Scales and Joel.
Thank you. Let me see if the screen sharing is going to work. Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ruben. I appreciate the introduction and the respondents. I love the extra attention that's paid to the event. We don't do that enough. I'm going to jump right in because I'm timing myself at 30 minutes. And I want to talk about a big subject. And this is usually the sort of shocking slide that I show to people outside of Houston who don't have a clue. You guys have a clue of what this kind of threat and exposure is and means. This is, of course, the hurricane we had in 2017, Hurricane Harvey. And it has been definitively placed within the realm of climate disruption and climate change. There was more moisture in the sky. There's much higher water temperatures in the Gulf, and the current steering currents were very weak. And the storm parked itself over Houston for 4 days, making the largest rainfall event in recorded history in the United States, and causing $125 billion worth of damage, and leaving a lot of us scratching our heads as to what exactly to do to respond to this from the world of design. Adaptation is certainly in order, and we think about that on a piecemeal basis, but we're not thinking about it, we're not going back to the source and figuring out the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem. And to do that, maybe you've heard of the Great Acceleration. As time has gone on, I found I've had to do less and less explaining about climate change, about the Anthropocene, about its origins, and where we are heading, and which is good because I think it's part of the larger general conversation. It certainly falls under your category of inhabiting the planet. This is it's come to be called the Great Acceleration, which was an attempt, grew out of an attempt to date the origin of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is, of course, the proposed geological marking of the beginning of an age dominated by a single species, us. And it was originally thought that the timing would start with the Industrial Revolution, but once they actually did the homework and started looking at the effects of industrialization and the effects of humans on the planet, they came to 1950, which is remarkable because it's almost in my lifetime that all of this has occurred. What you see on the bottom are what are called hockey stick graphs. These sort of straight up mapping of, among other things, climate disasters, species extinction, GDP, paper consumption, rainforest loss, population index, international tourism, a lot of natural factors that have been really pushed off the chart. These are nitrogen, temperatures, ozone, and the cause and the source of our problems, as we could imagine from looking at the first image, are huge. They're Promethean, to use a word. This is what has produced this, and how to intersect this particular problem at the scale at which it exists, I think is an enormous challenge for us in design. I think there are many reasons to, I think there are many ways to approach it, to attack it. But one of the thing that I have focused on has to do with the scale of the problem, as you will see. Second thing that really, besides the great acceleration that got me looking for the origins of our problems, is this thing called the Technosphere. 2017 study estimated the mass of the global technosphere, which is a material habitat that humans have created in support of the species. Massive fleets of cars, airplanes, continental expanses of managed landscapes, billions of buildings, and the physical and electronic infrastructure that supports it all. Scientists did a report in 2019. It weighs in, I'm not quite sure how they managed to weigh it, at 30 trillion tons, some 5 times the weight of the human beings that it sustains. It's approximately 4,000 tons of transformed Earth per human being, or 27 tons of technosphere for each pound of a 150-pound person. It is a virtual exoskeleton for the species. Everything we do through the technosphere. Prepare a meal, we do through the technosphere. Prepare a meal, buy a shirt, message a colleague, fill a prescription, or simply take a bath. In spite of its importance to our basic survival, all of these activities and the familiar objects that enable them come to be perceived as threats to our survival. As it turns out, just being human and alive in the world today requires a significant carbon expenditure that cannot be simply sloughed off. This is at the heart of our problem, and it is an attempt not to understate it, that there are no silver bullets, there are no simple solutions. It is called a wicked problem for that reason. The scope of what we have built is being related to the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the cryosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere. In other words, what we have made is not only competing in scale to those natural spheres, it's in danger of destabilizing them completely. And while we can't turn away from that, and we can't turn to easy solutions, like plugging our high energy lifestyles into a solar panel, I think we have to look at this in a certain measure. The little diagram on the lower right, I wrote it down there, it's to forestall a Malthusian panic attack, my own panic attack, which I've gotten over only recently, however. And what this is based on, you see all the blue lines that are of the great acceleration, how everything is going out of scope and putting us into incredibly dangerous territory. The pink line is the line not of population growth, that's still a hockey stick, but a population growth rate, which turned around in 1963 and has been dropping precipitously ever since. I think this is necessary for balance. I used to just fly in with the great acceleration, and I think it's a more complex picture than that. No one seems to know exactly why the growth rate has slowed down, but it is something turning a J curve into an S curve that I think we can work on and work with. This is my connection. This is how I started thinking about relating it to our own discipline. And it's a long quote, apologies. I couldn't make it any shorter, from Bruno Latour. And this is the last thing I'll read. There's something deeply troubling about the many ecological demands to suddenly restrict ourselves and try to leave no more footprints on a planet that we have nevertheless already modified through and through. It appears totally implausible to ask the heirs of the emancipatory tradition of modernism to convert suddenly to an attitude of abstinence, caution, and asceticism, especially when billions of other people still aspire to a minimum of decent existence and comfort. You can perhaps think of this as the slow growth or the no growth movement. It might not be the time to sound the retreat and betray the progressive ethos of modernism by suddenly becoming ascetics. If modernism was Promethean, the massive acceleration of a green economy and clean technologies that scientists argue is needed would be Prometheus squared. And yet, and I may just type a little bigger, it is still unquestionable that there is something deeply flawed in the hubristic tone of so much hype about technological solutions to ecological crisis. This is talking about geoengineering. Is there a way to explore a positive, energetic, innovative set of passions to repair and pursue the modernist experience at a more fundamental level? Can we imagine a Dr. Frankenstein who would not flee in horror at the creature he bungled at first, a Frankenstein that actually goes back to his laboratory? Can Prometheus be reconciled with the seemingly antithetical notions of care and caution? So if I were to try to sum up what I've been attempting to do, it is to go back into the laboratory of modern urbanism and to say that while there have been horrendous outcomes from the modern urban project, it is a project that needs to continue to be worked on. It is the legacy at which we can begin to attack some of these problems, largely because the urban problems we face today have nothing in common with the urban problems of even 50 years ago. This is our piece of the Technosphere in Houston. This is ironically called the Energy Corridor. It also happens to be the widest freeway in the United States, 25 lanes, not counting feeder roads. It's not enough. It's crowded. It's jammed. It is the sort of crazy hockey stick diagram as it's been translated into our world of urbanism and into our world of design. 75% of Houston is built like this, not on a grid, but on a series of spines based on a freeway infrastructure. That 75-25 split is common for all American cities, and it's even higher in Europe. The relationship between energy expenditure and density has been proven over and over and over again. On the diagram on the bottom left, the vertical column is energy expenditure. The horizontal column is people per square mile density. Houston's in one corner, Hong Kong is in the other corner. The more dispersed the city, the greater its energy footprint, to an extraordinary magnitude, actually. And if we are confronted with the fact that the United States has over 4% of the world's population and accounts for over 30% of the carbon emissions, we don't have to ask why. We can point at this particular image and say, this energy footprint is unsustainable. This city has no future. Unfortunately, it's how every city in the United States is being built now. Certain restrictions notwithstanding. And what we really have to tackle and address as designers. This is a kind of remarkable diagram from Berkeley that mapped carbon emissions by zip codes. The greater emissions push you into the yellows and the oranges and the reds, the lesser emissions is in the green. This is the, if you recognize the the detail, that's Manhattan, and the little blurb in the middle is Central Park, Brooklyn at the bottom, the Bronx at the top, and then New Jersey over the left. What it is about what the ring of development that the city had reached at about 1950. Everything outside of the 5 boroughs and outside of the early 19th and early 20th century development of New Jersey is what's called Megapolis. It is this, and it is a sprawl. It is the problem that we have, and the scope of the problem that we have to address is the energy expenditure that we are currently committed to, and how in the world could we possibly transform that, given the fact that it's built into the very infrastructure that keeps us alive. So this is, on the right-hand side, is a provocative image of the Unité Corbusier, very dense building, dense in the modern sense, where it has a high population, yet it does not create a dense urban environment, and is in some ways where we pick up the story of density, where we left it off. There is not a contemporary model of density. Our model of density, last model of practical density is this one, which is Midtown, which is inside the loop of Chicago. And this is not a viable model today. We do not lay out cities and grids, especially grids as small as in Manhattan anymore. We lay them out differently. And the idea of just piling up buildings on a grid, huge buildings on a tiny grid, is not a model. It's a kind of catastrophe that has had some remarkable and beautiful results, but it's nothing we can take with us into the future. But if for no other reason, because it is so dated and we can't reproduce its premises. So the diagram on the upper left is per capita energy consumption. So there we are at the top. European cities, Japan are running in the middle, and the bottom is the world average in China, still largely agrarian, and although changing fast. But also down at the bottom is Hong Kong, which is the only modern city that I have found, although I think Seoul would be in the category if I did the research, to put us in the range of the amount of emissions we're going to have to try to hit. In other words, there is a chance that we can sustain certain aspects of our modern urban lifestyles and still come within the threshold of a decent climate and planet. But it requires that we think through what that very infrastructure that we have been building for the last 75 years, the infrastructure of Megapolis, and take on whatever we can that will help us move forward. Because I'm being fast, I'm going to also be, unfortunately, a little bit short and rude. These are 3 examples of architects we all know: OMA, Foster Partners, and Piano and Rogers. And they are cutting-edge architects committed to the technology of architecture, to the envisioning of the future. But when it comes to cities, what they do is look backwards. So the waterfront city is a little bit of Manhattan, very prominently displayed in the literature of the project as a traditional city blocks and surrounded by bridges that connect to boroughs, and one of the boroughs is a souk, as a model for development in contemporary Dubai. Of course, this is not any of that. This is designed by one hand at one time to look like it was built like New York over many generations and by many hands. The second one by Foster, which is even more egregious, being a disciple, so-called, of Buckminster Fuller, Inspired, this is Mostar City. Inspired by the architecture and urban planning of traditional Arab cities, Mostar City incorporates narrow streets, the shading of windows, exterior walls and walkways, thick-walled buildings, courtyards, and wind towers. Piano in Berlin, this was built, the Daimler plots, with its surface area of 600,000 square meters. The scheme has the dimensions of a small town. And like a village, is designed around a piazza with the focal point as the focal point of the project. The middle of bombed out Berlin is in no way related to this sort of cité-esque planning. But the bigger question is why the backward look when so much of what they are engaged in architecturally is headed in the opposite direction. The question really is why the split? Why the backwards in one turn and look forwards in the other turn? And if we want to look forward, what do we look at? So Ruben mentioned the book I wrote called Ladders, which is about how in 1950 we completely changed our pattern of organization from grid-based, which you see in the middle of the, if you see my cursor right there, to spine-based, which is the infamous cul-de-sac. And that in Houston, as in other cities that are centric, there's a loop, which is like a tree ring in 1950 around the city, which completely divides the world between the grid-based center pre-1950 and the spine-based periphery. Although it's hard to call it a periphery because it is actually outgrown the host. This is actually the diagram is statistically accurate, where 25% of the street surfaces exist inside the loop pre-1950 and 75% outside. If you want to follow that thought, Paris inside the peripherique, which is their loop, just after the Second World War, it was planned. Less than 20% of the people of Paris live inside the loop, inside the periphery, 80% live outside. We have been trying hard to base our urbanism on the traditional urbanism of the grid because we love it, myself included. But the realities tell us, I think, to look elsewhere and to understand the patterns that we are presently building and have building and become the majority of the city. Because if we don't, we are rendered irrelevant or relegated to preservation projects within the older urban core, which are increasingly being turned over to tourism and the 1%. So that little diagram right here, this little is an emblem of a spine-based urbanism, a discontinuous closed urbanism outside the loop. This is an example of one that we've worked in, and it's the one project I'm going to show you, which is in Westbury. It's a neighborhood that was laid out in the 1960s. And you can see there are spines in it, but it's all closed development, the cul-de-sacing that turns each of these developments into an isolated unit with one or two entries into it. We need to work in this area. And there are various ways we do. We've developed the tools to work with it. In Westbury, you can see on the right-hand side, this is a tactical representation. That's what it looks like on the ground. We abstract it into a kind of diagram just so we can see clearly the larger issues. Notice immediately the number of intersections that are not built in that area, at the lack of continuity between the various elements of this neighborhood, effectively breaking it into 10 or 12 separate parts. And then what I want to talk about, what we focused on is in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a new project called the Willow Waterhole, which is a flood control project, which brings me back to Hurricane Harvey and our problems in Houston. Let's see what I've got next. There it is. There are 150,000 structures in the 100-year floodplain in Houston. And that 100-year floodplain is generally agreed to be a joke. It's more like a 20-year floodplain. Some people say a 10-year floodplain. We have an enormous problem, which, like climate change, is almost possible to address because it's very hard to imagine the solutions. What we want to do, what we can do as designers, is exactly that, which is to imagine the solutions. What can we do? Is there a way to tackle this problem? So what this one project that we've been working on does is talk about how we can remove systematically, by design, remove structures from the floodplain. We call it a retreat from the floodplain, and a rebuilding at a higher scale, a higher density, for the reasons I talked about before. The retreat project is the project of the 21st century, because not all cities flood like Houston, and not all cities are going to be subject to sea level rise. But let's say that they are going to, the retreat is going to represent the majority of the urban problems that we're facing in the coming decades. If, as I take as Houston as an example, and not to mention Miami, is not in the future, it's right now. So it's on Braised Bayou. It's a fantastic watershed. Rice is on Braised Bayou and no one knows it. That's the floodplain map. And the green circle there is the map I was just showing you. It's this one. And you can see the extent of the flooding. This is our most urban bayou. It has almost 1 million people living in the watershed. And it's a massive problem. This is where, you know, a quarter of the 150,000 houses exist. And this is what we have on the bottom right, which is the city, the suburbs of the Great Acceleration and the Megalopolis. And this is the Willow Waterhole, which I told you about, which is a fantastic project, which is ironically right in Westbury. It was reclaimed. It is a buyout of industrial property, easier to do because they're bigger owners. And it holds water from moving downstream. This is called the retention volume, because this is retained within the park at all times, this amount of water, because it's a public amenity. It is a public, it's an incredibly beautiful public park and social space, even as it is disconnected from the city, from the neighborhood right now, and directly adjacent to the low-income housing that surrounds it. Ironically, multifamily housing, low-income housing, they're almost synonymous in Houston in many ways. It was built around the industrial district. It's a very nice little piece of poetic justice that it is now sitting in the middle of this, yet that housing just is a nightmare. It's a horror show. These really nasty little barrack buildings that are fenced in, no public space other than what's provided for a parking lot, the cheapest construction you can imagine. We have no business, I mean, just to be able to offer an alternative to this model of development would make the project worthwhile. We'll throw in flood reclamation, buyouts, climate change. If we can just demonstrate that there are alternatives to this way of living. This is the project that the first project that we proposed for the Westbury area, upstream of the Willow Waterhole, which is still flooding, despite the fact that the waterhole, it doesn't hold water that goes upstream. It only keeps the downstream safe. What we're doing is adding a tail onto Willow Waterhole by building, by clearing the infrastructure and building using an alternative model of construction to replace the lost units and to allow the city to grow as it wants to and as it will, whether we want to or not. This is just a partial list of the people who worked on this project with me. We pay tribute to housing projects. Really good, innovative housing projects are few and far between, and we need to praise the ones that exist. And this is one, the Sejima project by Sejima called Gifu Apartment Blocks, which is where we came up with the methodology for this and other aspects of the project that we're working on. Is characterized by these three units. Every unit gets a separate pass-through elaborate balcony space. It's galleries, so they're all of the units are through units, and there's a variety. These are their unit types. And this is when you take those types and pack them into the volume that she had. And this is the bigger set from which the types came, which we added to the program. As far as we know, they didn't ever analyze this, that you can look at all the variations as a set of types. And type in this sense means nothing more than typical forms that relate to each other and work with each other, in this case, to allow the packing. This was our scheme. I'm out of time, so we're I'll shortchange it. We moved back and forth between south and north facing units. It is flow through. They're 12-foot ceiling heights. It's made out of wood. It's got an enormous number of variations in it, 3 basic sizes, 15 configurations that are linked together to create you can see the alternate patterning that moves up. It's made out of cross-laminated timber, kind of like a big crate. And it is the intention is to use as little artificial heating and air conditioning as possible. As is possible, we look back at buildings in Houston. One of the things that characterized pre-air conditioned buildings was their thin section. This is the layout, and this is our methodology. And the other one point I want to make is that we need to decide if we want to build a city or not. And if we want to build a city, we have to start thinking about how you put units together in a way that complements each other. This was our strategy of taking 3 separate types. The reason that traditional typology has failed, why it doesn't work, is that it is too strict. We can't place the world into these 3 separate types or other ones that you might come up with. One of the things we can do is this. We can start thinking about hybrid arrangements. This gets us into a territory that architects are loath to go, which is methodology. I can evoke the name of Christopher Alexander to talk about anxiety, including my own, about methodologies and how they apply to design. But I think we need to be smarter about it. I think not that long ago, I was standing in a review and all my students had, here's a model, here's a model, here's a model, here's a model. And they were all celebrated for their difference, right? Here's Joey's project, here's Beth's project, here's Sarah's project. And without a sense of what does that mean? How do these things come together? And if you don't start thinking about how we combine these things, are you actually serious about making a city? So we have a methodology, and that's a shorthand version of it, a table of variants that are then superimposed. And we came up with these 3 basic types that are, one of them is a simple slab type, one of them has combined with the podium, and the third one has a separate pavilion associated with it, as the ability to create an urban increment that is either complete, like this one, or is based on other similar elements being close to it. This is the view of one of the types, this one, the second variant from the Waterhole. This is the second one. And that starts to bring us into the urban dimension of this project, which is really based on the ability to create space as a bonding agent within the contemporary city. not the tight spaces of old streets or old piazzas or plazas, but relatively large spaces, which nonetheless are able to capture a coherent volume and elevate it to the level, potential level of public inhabitation, like so, where we have the floodplain, you have the 99% of the time it looks like it's on the left, 1% of the time it looks like it's on the right. That in this case, the tight core of S4 is brought together. These are our spatial types. We can interchange them, use them any way we want. For those of you who know Melanson Art, we love that project because it talks about, it's an OMA project, 1987. It basically, what it says is that the binding agent of a modern city, a post-1950 city, is not form, it's space. For any number of reasons, which are actually fairly elegantly explained in SMLXL, which I'm sure you all have. This is the larger scaled aggregation as we move up and combine the types. And the key to this is time and the temporal dimension. I'll finish on this, that a thought experiment, that buildings in the United States are bemoaned because they're so badly built and they have such a short lifespan. Can we turn that around and say, what is the average lifespan of a building? It's about 50 years, 80 years, 70 years for domestic architecture, 20 years for commercial architecture. It's a 50-year turnover. The city, despite all evidence to the contrary, is constantly turning over. If we got into a time machine, and I went out on Main Street, got into a time machine, came out 50 years later, everything in that time from this moment to that would have been built, right? Everything in the last 50 years would be, everything we're looking at would have been built in the last 50 years. That is our design opportunity, is to sync our design into the otherwise temporal cycles that exist within the city. And it's represented on all aspects of this project. So the first phase, the buyout, you just buy out and plant trees. The second phase, 2 buildings. The third phase, 6 buildings. The fourth phase, 4 buildings. Fifth phase, another 4 and 6 fills in the set. These are the statistics on the left. You're building at high density. You're bringing it around an open space corridor. This corridor is actually connected to what in Houston called Bayou Greenways, is a 150-mile linear park system as of this last year, all in the public domain. It's a new type of urbanism that attempts to work within the parameters of the suburbs and transform them incrementally over time. We had to rebuild bridges because they're major obstacles. And we chose that as a way to make urban centers. And what we are generally trying to do is to create an image of what an American city can be. And there are not that many available images, I don't think, unless I'm not doing my research well enough. What could a city look like? Could it have a network that is green? Could it be built out of wood? How might that evolve? How might that happen? What are the mechanisms that can be used over time that would allow for a transformation that started to make sense in a way of reducing our energy footprint, reducing our carbon emissions, and making some real headway in addressing the problem of the floods that both of our cities suffer from. And that's it. So we have other, let me release this. Yeah, we have other projects that do variations on that theme. We've been working on the typical methodology for typical form for 7 or 8 years. We did a project in Detroit that had nothing to do with flooding, but had to do with increasing density. So these are, I think you can find that project online. These are all attempts to answer what I think is a crucial question, which is what is our response as designers? How do I don't want to be an environmental activist. I think in times of crisis, this last year, social, environmental, political, public health crises, the most important thing to do is to do our job. I can't think of more solid advice than that, but it's just not easy to do. I would, and I do. I try to participate at a political level, just at the point of being a good citizen, right? I think we all probably do. But I can do that. That's not hard to encourage. What's hard to do is to find that productive area of design and where it can have the greatest effect. And with regards to our cities, who else is going to do it? Engineers? Who's going to design? If we don't design our cities, if we don't step up at scale, at the scale of the problem, who is? Who knows enough about design and design processes to take that on? We're the only ones in the room. So that I think is a kind of overview of what we've essentially been up to, maybe for the last 6 or 7 years, and through twists and turns have tried to refine an approach to architecture and design. So that's enough for me. If you guys, I'm happy. I love answering questions, even if they're hard ones.
You want to start, Margarita, or should I start?
Go.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you threw at us. I told you, I have like 3 pages scribbled full of notes of millions of questions. So, I mean, lowering the ecological footprint, be sustainable, increase density, restore the habitat, the void in between. I think I agree with all of this. This is, and you talked about the space is very important, the space in between. For me, I have a question. So when I say yeah, all of this, yes, definitely. And then density has to be increased. And then for the question I have is, how did the jump to the slab happen? And then there's another one. And then I look at this and I wonder, what do we understand about, what do you think urbanity is? Like when you say we have to make cities again, but then I see the image of the 4 slabs. And it reminds me of East Berlin after the World War II, when in the East, they built the slabs, the Corbusian slab, and they had these vast areas that people wanted to live because they had good apartments, but in terms of urbanity, it was a disaster.
Yes, we're trying.
So yeah, that was my question.
Okay, so
go ahead.
There are 2. One is where do we get to slabs, and the other is what is our definition of urbanity? And to answer the first one, the second one first, we have a lot of well-intentioned people who see the model of urbanism for Houston as Brooklyn, and it doesn't scan. It is not who we are, what we are, and it cannot be implanted on top of the world, the 75% of the world that we've been living in. That's why I look at the spine And my general approach to spine-based urbanism is that there are good spines and bad spines, just like there are good grids and bad grids. Unfortunately, most of the spines that we have to look at, by which I mean cul-de-sacs, are bad. And they don't take on the job of urbanization. That doesn't condemn the class because we have to take them on. Someone has to take them on, as I said. And I think the virtue of to talk about the urbanity, I would have to say that I threw in that comment about at the end about the network that runs through Houston, the 150-mile network, which is made out of bayous. It's a natural system. Some of it looks like storm sewer. All of it is in the public domain and is already a viable public realm, mostly for recreation. No one has really seen its value as a legitimate public space. 60% of the population lives within walking distance of a bayou. Brooklyn is one form of walkability, and I love it, right? I absolutely love it. This is a different form of walkability that comes out of the logic of contemporary spine-based urbanism. They could not have put that 150 miles together if the Harris County had been gridded solid, and if the land prices had been as high as they would be if we had been building dense. Now that we've got this natural armature, we have something to hang our public hopes on. It's a bigger scale. I was talking about the width between the two blocks. And that maybe gets us where the slab was. The slab was proportioned to create that space emphatically between the two blocks in order not to create a street space or even a plaza space, but a coherent enough space that would allow a different kind of urbanity to take hold, one that related to the context, by which I mean the natural environment which threads through it. The section of the bridges that I told you about is where we do points of concentration, where we really get serious about mixing programs and in order to produce a kind of urbanism that makes sense here and is in the right location. But the slabs initially came from creating of clearing the floodplain and creating a public realm, and of thinking through the scale that would have to be accomplished to really move us out of the single family house, out of our pickup trucks and SUVs, and into a very different lifestyle. We are hoping, and it's a strange hope, that the blocks of Berlin, which I've seen, are actually quite much larger than this, and this sounds glib, but it's not. They're not made out of wood. Wood is a game changer. That we can do wood at scale. Wood will change. Just imagine the worst environment, the worst sort of rudest public housing project you can think of, and then imagine that it was actually built out of wood, and the qualities of wood were allowed to affect the environment, meaning you don't cover it all up, as a kind of game changer for larger scale construction. I also think another reason the slab got to be the way it is that we wanted it's a sort of crate that the wind flows through. Wood needs to be aerated. You know, if you go to a lumber yard, you have to stack wood with pieces of wood so it doesn't rot. What we have to do with wood construction is make sure it doesn't rot because it loses its CO2 if it does. There were a lot of things coming together that trying to not use air conditioning, trying to use a decent material that was not as abstract as concrete. All of these things were kind of tied up in the decision and actually the proportion and dimensions of the slab. And the problem with, finally, the problem that is not urban, the things that the examples that you mentioned, any bad Radiant City project is the absence of any kind of sophisticated typological variation, which is what we're trying to produce, right? That to just knock out the same slab 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, sometimes it's charming, rarely. We've seen examples in Hong Kong, but I think we need a more robust taxonomy that the simple, the more traditional types cannot give us because of the complexity of modern programs and their scale and size. Modern cities, I mean, traditional urbanism, much as I love it, it can't do a big box store. It can't do a parking garage. It can't do an airport. It doesn't have the ability to accommodate complex programs like across the street from us, hospitals, which aggregate buildings, right? Many buildings that are connected together, which is what the typological project was about, why we started it. So this is a crude, intentionally a kind of crude project and a first step, some of our first steps, and thinking through how you make this in urbanism. But that is our intent. It will be of a scale that would probably, I'm guessing from your background and stuff, that it might be a scale that you don't associate with urbanism, and you would be right, except unless you look at the urbanism of parks. But nonetheless is aiming towards an urbanism and a public urbanism in a contemporary context, nonetheless.
Okay, can I jump in? So I mean, under my view, the lecture was extremely clear in its diagnosis, and I think we would all agree on this. Of course, the energy, the great acceleration, the density needed to comply with this threshold of energy reduction. Maybe the question is energy transition with it. And also the retreat from the floodplain is really clear, and the way you do it. And the role of the designer is also like paramount today. So I think that's we all are, I guess, or should be in the same direction in many ways, and linking architecture to urban for that reason of scale, right? So to me personally, the heart of the matter here is to test form on the one hand, and whether with slabs or whether with because we know that the American culture has this resistance to density, right? And how do we urban form appealing to the desire of land ownership or the land? No, this kind of bigger question of a cultural question of migrating from one dream to another one, so through design. So I think this is an important question, and I wonder if you looked at, for example, things like the state, the Anglo-Saxon lineage of states that are in the land, and this idea of, I mean, cultural lineages of inhabitation that might migrate. So in addition to tapping into modernist culture, tapping into traditional or pre-suburb way of inhabiting to kind of hybridize these two. That's one question. So in terms of the possibilities or the differences of to me, that is heart of the matter of the building form, and that can be on top of the spine. And the other question is that the metabolism of the city, how the metabolism of the city can inform what you're like further maybe, or increase or give layers of depth. I mean, I know I'm sure you have worked on that several years more than myself, because we have only had 30 minutes now. But I'm curious about the not only the mobility, but also the energy that you mentioned before in your studio, the energy transition, wind, solar, And also the greenery as a green infrastructure, but not only for floods, but for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and all the things that the green infrastructure and the other way of looking at cities like urban habitats can do with the scheme you have, right? So maybe the explanation is not as much about the taking on the modernity and bringing back, but yes, modernity plus all these, no? To make it the city of the 21st in a way. I think it's fascinating discussion.
Yeah, I think it is going back into the urban laboratory, but it's definitely to learn from the horrible mistakes that have been made and build on them like any kind of rational process. Migrating from one lifestyle or one dream to another via architecture, that's quite beautiful. And I think it's an overlooked aspect of our job. That most people don't prefer alternatives because they've never seen them. And I like to think that that's one of the things that we are up to in this. I have an answer that would sound a little bit glib. So you have to let me explain. I don't think we're going to have a choice to continue to live the way we're living now. I just got blown over by a book by Elizabeth Colbert called Under the White Sky. The white sky is a reference to geoengineering. She's a writer for the New Yorker. And talking about the geoengineering, they're talking about at Harvard shooting sulfates into the atmosphere to bounce light back, right? Just nightmare stuff. And the point that's made in the book is that these guys make is, you think there's going to be a choice? We're going to have to do this. When people, and read the book, because I'm not doing it justice, okay? So I don't think, I think if cities over time have largely formed around necessity instead of lifestyle choices, and I think we're in that now, and I think we're going farther and farther into that, such that the sort of migration from one dream to another is going to be forced upon us. I also have an enormous faith in generational change. And it's like my projects. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, and it can't. But over a generation, it can. We've seen remarkable changes in the world. We've seen attitudes of entire countries, like the attitude towards the Vietnam War, or in the 60s, or the attitude towards gay marriage, turn on a dime, right? I don't think it's so far-fetched to imagine that we can make this transition from one dream to another. I think we really need to work towards that. And in some ways, I think your question had the answer in it, which is that migrating from one lifestyle to another is what architects do, and that's what we do. And if I can, there's a survey that's done every year. The Kinder Foundation in Houston does it. And every year it goes up. How many people want to spend less time in their car and want to be able to walk into a restaurant and buy groceries? Yet there's no accompanying image. There's no plausible scenario about how that can come into existence. That's our job. I think we spent way too much time designing opera houses and not enough time paying attention to issues like these. I think opera houses are important, and they're some of my favorite buildings, but my God, we've got many other things that we can do as well. And I think that is one of them. And will we change? Will we be able to migrate fast enough It's not looking good, according to the scientists. That's just what it is. We look at the IPCC trajectories that they're running. We're going to fly right by 2 degrees. That's when other criteria kick in. It's not about lifestyle choice, right? It's not, oh, I think I'd rather live here rather than there. It's going to be a much more wrenching level of change. The quicker we start making it, the better. But I think it's, you know, I trust, because I know a lot of scientists who live on my campus, I trust their predictions. And I also think that that's going to change the metabolism of the city at the larger scale. And that's a much harder one to talk about, but it's also one of the most interesting aspects of the city, is because most people don't realize that cities actually have metabolisms. You're already on a fairly high point when you're talking about the metabolism of the city. So for example, the fact that I'm talking about phasing, that's part of metabolism, right? It changes over time and it manifests itself. To what we really, the more clear we can be about that change and how we intervene in that metabolism, meaning let's do it 10 years at a time instead of coming in with a bulldozer, or let's look at how, for example, the way a grid city grows. We were talking about this earlier. The way a grid city grows, it just grows and grows and grows and grows. There's a great website on what street you would live on in Manhattan if the Manhattan grid covered the country, which is really about the idea of the 19th century city and its continuity, and how we stopped that and began to grow in terms of cul-de-sacs and spine-based urbanism, which has a completely different metabolism from the continuous spread of the grid. We need to understand that, how it works, why it happened, and what are the worst and best aspects of it. That's definitely the level, we need to get to that level of thinking. And I think that the last thing I would say about that is that requires scale, right? You can't see the metabolism on a city block or 5 city blocks or even 10. You're talking about the transformation at an enormous scale. The transformation from the grid to the spine took place in every American city and cities around the world, all within 20, 30 years of each other. We have to think about metabolism at that scale too. So I think it's part of the bigger picture.
One of the big, oh, okay.
Sorry, we have.
I just wanted to say one of the big elements for me too is that there's so many people who don't have a decent place to live, even in America. I mean, in America too. So that's another aspect that maybe we are really focusing a lot on, like lifestyle and form and whatever, whereas a lot of people, that's not the question for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not, and I don't think it's going to be a question for us long, the lifestyle choices. And if you really want to think big scale, you just count the number of housing units we're going to need to house the population, not including the population here, but the population that's coming in the next 50 years. And if you really want to think about that, and if you want to think about the fact that one of the things we stress and confound much of the university around us who's otherwise predisposed to collaborate is that you can't have an engineering project over here and an urban reform project over here and a landscape project over here. They have to be one project or they're never going to happen. They have to be integrated into a project. So if we're trying to house millions of people in the coming decades, millions and millions, it has to be done in a way that solves multiple problems at once. And that is really, the city is that entity which combines and connects all of these isolated issues that by definition, an urban project is an integrated project. I have to, that just came out of my mouth without me thinking about it, because we have a flood, the Braised Bayou that I told you about has had $100 million recently spent to make it more resilient and to keep flooding down. It just gets worse and worse and worse. It has failed as an engineering project, flat out. The freeway I started out with, 25 lanes, that's what happens when you specialize. Okay, let's make a transportation project and let's make it about freeways. The more narrow you get, the less effective it is, and the harder it is to do all the things that we need to do. They need to be integrated with each other. So I think I get into trouble with community organizers when I show them. I tend to show the most committed grassroots people the first two phases of the project. It's one of the nice things about working in phases. The environmentalists want to see the last phase. They don't care about anything else. We're going to come in and plant trees. The one we did in Detroit was about, the first 10 years was about planting trees in Corktown, and then replacing all the substandard housing. That has to do with Marguerite's question about the migrating from one lifestyle to the next. You want to address the change over time. And when I talk to people in the community, the first question I ask them is, are you planning for who comes next? One of the cycles that we plan for is that the average renters in the United States move every 2.5 years. Homeowners move every 8 years. Let's say 5 years is your residency cycle. That over 5 years, you do nothing in a city, right? That what happens in the next 5 years, cities have a long fuse. So I try to explain to people who are living in the community now, the obligations that we have to them immediately, which obviously come up with when you have a flooding problem, but what is it going to deliver in the future? And do you care about that? Or do you just care about your residency here? And I've never been told that that's all they care about. They do care about what happens to Westbury next or any other city next. And they want the things that they build now to be relevant to a better future. And it's just a matter of laying that out, of basically talking about urbanism and what it is, how it works, and what our choices are given any specific situation. That makes sense? Is a way to start addressing that problem. We had, you probably had in New Orleans after Katrina, we had one, incredibly well-intentioned and productive people on the ground and doing great things for different neighborhoods, because we all know the kinds of neighborhoods that tend to flood. But there was no coordination between them, right? They could not get any traction because they were looking at a very small area and doing great things there and helping people, and no one would ever take anything away from that. But our next step is to start to coordinate that stuff and say, well, we live in a bayou, this 150-mile network. Let's tie it into that, right? Let's tie it in, your small project into a bigger project. and watch it grow, watch it have a greater effect than it would if you just combined yourself to 10 blocks.
Let's take some questions. No, I think
Okay.
Ruben has prepared.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions from the audience, Albert. Scott Bernard is asking, is the city you envision a 50-year transformation of the existing suburban wall possible without some emphatic boundaries? For example, a hard limit to urban extension into the undeveloped land around the city to force an increase in density?
I wouldn't do a growth line like Portland and Boulder. I think it's a way. The reason I wouldn't do it offhand, and sorry, these are quick answers, not thoughtful ones, is the undigested problem of gentrification that you get with growth boundaries, and who's in and who's out mindset. And when you couple that with low densities, as in Portland and Boulder, it's bad. Maybe if they're in the mix of things, were the ambitions clear that growth boundaries would make sense, and maybe they don't have to be growth boundaries. But I'd rather, we think of the bayous as magnets, which attract things, as opposed to a boundary which repels things, and think that there's a better and more positive argument to be made from attracting as opposed to saying, making prohibitions. It's one of the problems that ecologists have. They say, you can't go here ever again. This is walled off forever. And how do you get people to appreciate the natural world if you wall it off? I think these projects, I have multiple diagrams. I have a public-private partnership. We've mapped out a route for public-private partnership. We've mapped out a developer scenario, and we have mapped out in the light of just these last few weeks, the reemergence of the state as a positive actor on the stage of public projects, publicly funded projects. The point, I think, for us is if we don't find a way to realize the projects, if there's not a clear and obvious way to realize projects, then those projects oftentimes don't get drawn. And that's not good. I think we need to, it's the cart before the horse. You have to know where you're going until you figure out how to get there, right? It's that line from Alice in Wonderland. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. You have to know what your destination is. And so much of the prohibitions, every architect who's listening has heard, you can't do that, right? We've all heard that. You can't do that. That's impossible. And where does that leave you, right? That leaves you nowhere. So in some ways, I think that we have to sort of, the way I tackle it is say, here's 4 ways we've imagined doing it, not one. And there's probably a 5th way that's going to be better. We just can't see it yet. Right. I've talked about carbon markets. There are ways that you can, different ways that you could do it. But I think what's important is to get the, as you said, get the dream out.
There is another question from Nick Jennings that is also talking about one of the comments of Irene. Irene asked about the urbanity that might be created. what might the trade-offs be in the floodplain example between adapting to the floodplain with housing towers versus greenfield development in safer areas, using more traditional urban forms like RICs?
Yeah, I think that what we're doing is not a singular model for the development of the city, that it needs that as well. And we haven't projected, we did project a drawing that showed after the life cycle of the single family houses was over, we showed it greening. But I don't think that even with the bayous as narrowly spaced as they are, so we're, you know, a lot of people are in proximity to them, it's certainly not enough. And there are other types of development that could occur. I would say that it has to be, it has to derive from our own world, and it can't be, it can't try, even if it's in a greenfield or it's rebuilt, so we can ignore the pattern development. There are a couple of examples of people trying to build Brooklyn in a parking lot on the Katy Prairie on the edge of the city, and it just isn't right. It won't work. It will not reproduce Brooklyn. So what those models are would be an open question. I think you say using more traditional urban forms, and I think with adaptation to fit the world in which we live. We still depend on 19th century urbanism, right? If we want to protest, we have to go into a 19th century street to protest because we don't make those spaces anymore. There is not an urbanism that reflects us. So I just get a little, it depends on what you mean by safer areas using more traditional urban forms.
I have maybe another question related, not as much about urban form as where do you think agriculture or food production lies into the urban model of the 21st century in terms of transitioning from suburban lifestyle that has consumed so much soil into a denser area, into the floodplains, and what happens with agriculture or the soil scarcity that is also a problem. So is that in the toolkit, or should it be in the toolkit of an architect?
I think we need to have a larger, I think we need to imagine the whole world, not just the urban world, or else you get this weird divide between cities being blue and counties or rural counties being red, which is astonishing to me that spatial division exists. And it's one of the reasons, that's what we talked about earlier, that I don't know enough about food production. You know, I read the journalist Michael Pollan, read Wendell Berry, who thinks we're all going to go back and cobble our own shoes. I think there's a kind of back to a kind of naivete about repopulating the landscape free of industrial practices. I don't think the drawdown in population that would require is something that I could handle. But I do think that we have a rich tradition from Lewis Mumford and regionalism in the United States, which is extraordinary, especially if you realize what's happened to that dream. It's divided into red and blue now. There's a wall between rural and urban counties. And it was the opposite of what that is. That's in our legacy. If you read Mumford and people associated with it, it's more tied to planning, which is unfortunate. Although newer, yeah, there. I think it needs to be a broader vision, which I can't claim to really have worked out for myself. But I don't think they can be separated. I mean, you see a lot of cool stuff, right? People you know, trying to work against the industrial paradigms. Yeah, maybe the infrastructure bill will not just be for cities. It shouldn't be.
Well, thank you so much, Albert. They are telling me from the organization that we are a bit over time. So
Okay.
I think that we should close here. So once again, thank you so much for this incredible lecture and conversation, Albert, and also Irene and Margarita for being here today. And to the audience, I would like just to mention that be sure to join us back also in 2 weeks on Monday, April 19th, at the same time as we will welcome our 2021 predoctoral teaching fellows, Andrea Bardon de Tena and Guillermo Locar, as they will present their work and research digitally to the school. So once again, Albert, thank you so much. Irene, thank you. Margarita, thank you so much.
To be continued, no?
Exactly.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. See you.
Thank you.